Welcome to Catholic Feedback. I'm your host, Keith Nestor. On this podcast, we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith with everyday life. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Down to Earth Ministry, a ministry of stewardship, a mission of faith, and by the generous support of our patrons. For more information, please visit downtoearthministry.org. That's down, the number 2, earthministry.org. Let's get to it. Welcome to Catholic Feedback. I'm your host, Keith Nestor. On this podcast, we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith to everyday life. I'm so thankful that you've decided to join me here on the podcast today. The way that I get my ideas for podcast episodes is simply by looking at the emails that I receive from people who send them to me at feedback@catholicfeedback.com. And really what I'm looking for are ideas about things that people consider important in Catholicism, but maybe they're just not really sure how it affects their life when the rubber meets the road. There are a lot of ideas like that. And oftentimes the questions I get deal with issues that I find very important in terms of understanding how these theological truths can affect us, in our day-to-day experience as Catholics. So when we talk about things like confession, or we talk about things like baptism, recent topics, what do those ideas mean to us in our lives? It's not just something that we think about once in a while or we're going through a class, but then it never has any impact on our faith. So for me, I was a pastor for many years, and I wanted everything I did to be super practical, to have there be something you could take away every time I preached a sermon, that when you left the church, you could take that and apply it to your everyday life. And that's something I brought with me into the Catholic faith. And what I'm finding is that there are so many incredible ways that our Catholic faith connects to our everyday lives to help us become more and more a disciple of Jesus Christ. Well, sometimes the questions I get are pretty basic, straightforward questions about different ideas or beliefs, and they lend themselves very well to podcast episodes like this. Other times, I get questions that I think are kind of interesting, but I'm not really sure if they'd make a good episode. Things about my opinion, or just like a simple matter-of-fact question, like, what is a mortal sin? Or do you believe in guardian angels? That kind of stuff where it's like, okay, I could answer that question, but I'm not really sure that I could make an entire podcast episode out of it. So I don't know, maybe someday I'll just do like a rapid-fire question where it's just bam, bam, bam. But then there are other times where I get questions that really just make me stop in my tracks, and I go, wow, this is really important, but I'm not really sure how this is going to go over, like how this can help people. And this is one of these episodes where I really believe that it's important to talk about, but it's also hard to talk about. Sometimes the things that are most important often are the things that are most difficult to talk about. And if you've been wrestling with the Catholic faith, or you are Catholic and you've got people around you that wrestle with the Catholic faith, there's no doubt in my mind that you're going to deal with this material today in a very personal way, because chances are you've been asked about it. Let me just dig into the email I got from Olivia. She says, "Hello, Keith. I'm enjoying your podcasts. Thank you so much for your ministry. I started watching you on YouTube, and your videos are great too. I'm learning so much." That's awesome. Thank you, Olivia. Anyway, how do you answer or explain the sexual abuse scandals that happened with the Catholic priests? The abuse happened for many years by so many priests and clergy, and many priests were just moved to other parishes, never reported, and so on. This is what I hear from other people. I'm a revert. I love the faith and love to share with family and friends, but this topic is very hard to talk about. Sometimes I'm not sure what to say. I can't defend it because I understand the concerns, the anger, but at the same time, I truly believe this is the church Jesus Christ founded almost 2,000 years ago. I would really appreciate some, quote, feedback on this topic. How to address this issue when it comes up. Thanks for all you do, Olivia. Olivia, I will tell you this. Thank you for your question. And at the end of the day, really, Olivia, I feel like your answer is found in your question. And of course, we'll get there and we're going to unpack this a little bit. But you do two very important things in this question that I think anyone who addresses this issue has to do. And the first one is this: you don't try to make excuses for it. You don't try to cover it up. You don't try to pretend like it didn't happen. And the second thing that you do that I find so very important, Olivia, is you still acknowledge that the Catholic Church is the church founded by Christ. See, that's the key to understanding how we are to deal with the abuse crisis and other crises. But specifically, we're going to talk about this one. Because the fact of the matter is this: no explanation that I give or that anybody else gives, that the Pope could even give, that anybody could give, can in any way minimize the evil and pain caused by the clerical abuse. See, I find that to be incredibly important. Sometimes when I hear people talk about this issue, I can hear people trying to say things like, well, yeah, there was abuse, but, it's not as bad as it is in other places, or it's not as bad as you might think, or do they really know, or whatever. And they quickly want to get off the topic and the subject to deflect that to someplace else, or to make it not sound like it's as horrific as it actually is. So when you're dealing with this issue, I think the first thing that you have to do is recognize that there's no explanation that you can give that's going to make it okay. There's nothing that you can say or do that's going to make that pain disappear or in some way, be minimized. So don't even try to do it. I think that's very important. And as a matter of fact, if you do try to do that, if you try to minimize that or try to downplay it in some way, then actually I believe that you're doing a greater disservice to the church. You're doing a greater disservice to people. Because the fact of the matter is this, friends: the evil, the hurt, the pain, the consequences of the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, that's immeasurable. There's no way to quantify that. There's no way even really to wrap your mind around how much hurt and pain and devastation that has caused. So we have to be careful that when we talk about these issues, that we don't in any way try to come across as insensitive or uncompassionate or try to minimize this behavior. And I know a lot of us want to protect the church, so we want to go to those things. And I've heard a lot of talks about this where people will point at like numbers and statistics and different things and say, oh, well, that was in the past and this and that and whatever. You know what? Here's the deal. If this is hurting someone or someone's been hurt by this, we have to honor that. We have to honor that hurt. So friends, let me just say this. Number one, don't try to minimize the evil and pain caused by clerical abuse. And I know that you wouldn't intend to do that, but sometimes the way we talk about things can come across that way. So we have to be very, very careful that we don't do that. The second thing that we have to keep in mind when we're addressing this issue is we can't judge how other people respond to this type of evil. And I know that that's something that we would never intentionally think to do, but when someone, for example, says, yeah, I was abused by a priest, or my friend was abused by a priest, or my child was abused by a priest, or something like that, and they've decided to leave the church or become very angry at the Catholic Church or whatever like that, sometimes we can have this judgmental attitude toward them, like, well, you just need to get over it. And we might not come out and say it like that right out, but back in the back of our minds, we're probably going, we might be going, well, you just need to deal with that. You need to get over that. You need to remember that the church is the true church. And yeah, people sin, but you know what? You could need to forgive and move on and recognize not everybody's bad and all the things that we talk about. What I want to say is this: you don't have the right to judge how someone else responds to that evil. Now, I'm not saying that any response to that evil is justified or is what anybody should do, okay? So don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that if someone has abuse in their family or in their life or whatever in some way, that they can just walk away from the church and it's no big deal, or they can just hate Catholicism and it's no big deal. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is this: I can't judge another person how they're dealing with something so horrific. We have to let God deal with that. Our job is not to judge, because here's the other part: we don't know the full story. We don't know how someone who might be in this horrible place where they've had to walk away from the church, but deep inside their heart, they're feeling pulled back by the Eucharist or by some aspect of the Catholic faith. And what they really need is for someone in the name of the church to come alongside them and love them with compassion, with no strings attached, without conditions. And then maybe, just maybe, that would be something that would be used to draw them back. But instead of seeing that, their pain gets minimized, or they feel judged by people who don't understand. Friends, we can't do that. Our job is to be led by the Holy Spirit and to be used by God to show His love to other people. Yes, in truth. And we're going to talk about what that looks like, because here at the end of the day, we have to have an answer. So when someone says to you, and of course, believe me, I've heard it said to me many times. I remember one time I was sitting down with someone, and he just looked across the table at me and he goes, "Well, I heard you just joined the worst church ever to exist." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Did you become a Catholic?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's just like, "How could you be a Catholic with all those priests that raped those little kids and that hurt all those people? How could you do that, Keith? Give me a break." Yeah. Put me on the spot, didn't it? And I'm sure a lot of you have gone through that. What do you say? What do you say when someone's just out to attack you and out to attack your faith? And that just seems to be like the most convenient, easiest way to throw mud at the Catholic Church and at individual Catholics. What do we say? Now, the truth is, we can't answer that in a way that makes it okay. So guess what? Don't put that kind of pressure on yourself, right? Don't try to go, "Oh, well, I have to come up with this perfectly crafted answer so that guy who already hates the Catholic Church and wants to throw mud at it can somehow be answered." Let me tell you something. He's not going to be answered. There's nothing you're going to be able to say to him that's going to make him stop and go, "Oh, wow. Okay, I get it now. That makes perfectly good sense to me. I'll become Catholic." This is not going to happen. If someone wants to just accuse and throw mud, sometimes the best you can do is just say, "Yeah, I get that. I understand. That's really hard. That was a struggle for me too." And just walk through that. Don't get all defensive and be like, "Yeah, well, what about you?" You got to recognize what's going on. You see, how you navigate this conversation can be tricky, because if you swing too far one way, then what can happen is you wind up, like I said a little bit earlier, making excuses and minimizing the severity of this crisis, and making people who feel like it's a big deal to them are overreacting or whatever. Or at least you will fail to recognize the pain, hurt, and consequences of what this type of sin can do, and some things that we say that might fall into that category is if we say things like, "Yeah, I know the abuse is bad, but abuse exists in other places too," right? It's a true statement. But when someone's talking about that, it's not always helpful to just go, "Yeah, but that guy too." I mean, think about it with your kids, right? He started it, but look what he did. Does that ever help when you're trying to deal with an issue? It never does. It never does. "Well, that happened a long time ago, but the church is doing much better now." That might be true, but at the end of the day, you got to be helpful and you got to be sensitive. Why? Because when someone has been abused, it doesn't matter if other people have been abused also. That doesn't make them feel any better. It also doesn't matter that the church is doing better now. If that was you, or if that was your kid, or if that was your brother or your sister, you can't step back and go, "Oh, well, you know what? It's all good. Things are better now. I feel better." When their abuse is what's on the table, you can't lose track of that. Now, at the same time, if you swing too far the other way, you can find yourself in all sorts of trouble believing and saying things that just aren't true. Things like this. "Well, yeah, you're right, the Catholic Church can't be the church founded by Christ and that contains the fullness of the faith if these abuses happened," which they did, "therefore it must not be. We're out of here." See, you can take that to a different place, to where you say, "Yeah, this disproves Catholicism." Or you could say things like, "Well, even if the church is true, The fact that the abuse occurred means that it's totally okay for someone to leave the church, right? You can't say that either. So what are you supposed to do? How do you navigate through this? Well, let me give you a couple ideas here. Okay, number one is this. When you're in these conversations, Olivia, and believe me, I know how tough these are. The first thing is this. How we talk about this depends on who we're talking to. It just really does. Are you talking to an abuse survivor? Or are you talking to someone who just wants to be a jerk and throw stuff in your face? You know, if I'm talking to someone who just wants to throw stuff in my face, like the guy I was talking to you about before, then yeah, I might mention some of those other things that are true about how, you know, there's nothing really unique to the abuse in the Catholic Church when it comes to abuse happening within people who have authority over other people. It happens in lots of places. It happens. There's really no more percentage-wise of people that have been abused in Catholicism than in other places. It's just that the Catholic Church is so much larger than any other denomination or any other group, right, that you might look at, that there's way more people. So, of course, there's going to be a higher percentage. But those are things I would share with someone who just wants to say, well, how can you be Catholic? How can you do that? But if I'm talking to someone who's been abused or someone who's like walked through that with someone, you better believe I'm not going to do that. See, you got to remember where you are and you got to remember to whom you're talking. Sometimes people need compassionate love and understanding and not a defensive, argumentative, response, which I like to give a lot of times. Sometimes that's the worst thing you can possibly do. Sometimes you just need to say, yeah, I'm sorry that happened to you. I can't even imagine the pain that you're going through, and I'm going to pray for you. Sometimes that's the best thing you can say. So you can't just have like a canned answer that whenever you're talking to someone, you have to bring that up. You gotta listen. You gotta dig a little deeper and try to understand where they're coming from, Olivia. So if that's happening to you, try to put that conversation into context, because if you don't, it could wind up really, really detrimental. Okay, the second thing is this. When you're able to really talk about this and someone really wants to have a conversation and dig into how does this impact, the idea of Catholicism and everything that the church claims to be, how do those two things go together? This horrible abuse and the claims of the church. Well, what you have to do is this. You have to disconnect the behavior of humans from the promise of God. Okay? Disconnect the behavior of humans to the promise of God. Now, you might say, what are you talking about? That's a very biblical thing to do, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the promise that God makes to his people, and we'll just start with the promise that God makes to Adam and Eve, right? He's walking with them. He's created them. He's dwelling with them. And what do? What's their behavior? Basically, he promised, he said, look, you can have every fruit of every tree in this garden except one. And everything will be great. And what do, friends? They go for the one tree and they fall away, and disaster. So then you look farther down the road, right? You see what happens. God creates the world and then he destroys it in a flood. But he saves Noah and his family. And what happens? Noah's not a perfect guy. He gets drunk and winds up in his tent, and he's not a perfect guy. But God's promise remains. And then, of course, you have this covenant that God makes with Abraham to turn him into a great nation. But is Abraham a perfect guy? Absolutely not. Friends, you look at some of the stuff that Abraham does where he takes his wife and gives her to Pharaoh because he's afraid that if he thinks that she's his wife, he's going to kill him. So he says, here, she's my sister. Have your way with her, right? Not awesome. Not awesome. And he goes and he conceives a child with his wife's servant, Hagar, because he's impatient and can't wait for the Lord. You see, you could look at that and say, well, did God then just did his promise fail? No. And then you can look at Moses and you can look at what happens when he brings the Israelites out of the desert, out of Egypt. And he delivers them from the hands of Pharaoh. And what are they? And he gives them this covenant. He gives them the law. What do they do with it? Right? Almost immediately, They turn their backs on him, and over and over and over again. Friends, this is the story of humanity. Do God's promises fail because of human behavior? Absolutely not. They didn't in the old covenant, and guess what, friends? They don't in the new covenant. See, when Jesus gave his promise to the church that the gates of hell would not prevail against it, never attached to that promise was this idea that human beings, even leadership of the church human beings, would operate perfectly and sinlessly. As a matter of fact, I think it was obviously everything that Jesus does is intentional. That right after he gives him that promise, he turns around and he calls him Satan. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." Almost immediately, human beings will begin to fail. And so on and so forth, friends. All you have to do is look back in history. Look back in your own life. Look back at everything you've experienced. Human beings can never be the standard for the promises of God in our behavior. We just can't be. So we have to disconnect this bad behavior. Now, I know it's really difficult because, friends, think of what we believe about Catholic priests. We believe that they are in the person of Christ. So what that can do to us is sometimes that can cause us to elevate these men into a place that maybe we shouldn't elevate them to. Now, when they're performing their sacramental roles and they're living, they're absolutely in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. Christ is working through them. It's Christ working through them. But that doesn't mean that they're not human beings, that they're not sinners. You better believe that when we see our spiritual leaders fall into sin, it's devastating to us because we equate them, whether we want to or not sometimes, with Christ. And it's especially true in Catholicism, which I think is why it's especially demonic and especially hurtful and damaging. But friends, we have to have a realistic understanding of this. We have to disconnect the behavior of humans from the promise of God. I know that's hard to do, and that's part of what we need to work on as we journey through this with people. And I think ultimately, really, when you talk about people who want to, talk about how bad the Catholic Church is, every church has scandals. Every denomination, every organization, every type of situation has its share of scandals. Why? Because it's got human beings. And human beings are scandal-making machines, okay? So no one can say, well, it's only the Catholic Church, so therefore the Catholic Church has to be bad and everything else is great. Obviously, that's not the case. But even in those worlds, we have to work on disconnecting the behavior of humans from the promise of God. Okay, now number 3 is kind of like number 2, okay? So if we recognize that God's promise is what it is, regardless of human behavior, we recognize that God's promise doesn't fall away on account of our sin. That's a powerful thing to think about. Number 3 is we have to recognize that everywhere there are human beings, there is sin. And as I just mentioned a minute ago, wherever you look, you're going to find sin. There's people want to argue about this, but technically speaking, there's no more of this type of behavior that takes place in Catholic churches than in other organizations as well. It's just that, again, we have a bigger target on our backs because there's so many more Catholics, and people love to, let's just face it, people love to hate Catholics more than anybody else. It's just true. So we got to recognize that, like I said, recap. Number 1, how we talk about it depends on who we're talking to. Number 2, we disconnect the behavior of humans from the promises of God. And number 3, we recognize that everywhere human beings are, everywhere, there's going to be sin. Now, number 4 is important. Scandals have been around since the beginning. Okay? So why is this important? Because oftentimes we can look at our own experience and think that something new is happening and that what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this? What's going to happen? And we can act like that what's happening to us has never happened in the past. And what I want to tell you is this. Scandals go back far before human beings even existed. You say, what are you talking about, Keith? Well, think about it. What do we believe about Lucifer and the demons, right? What was Lucifer? He was an angel. He was in heaven. And what are demons? They're fallen angels. So at some point in time in heaven, Lucifer rebels against God and takes a third of the angels with him. That's the first scandal, friends. And God chose to allow that. And he allows scandals for some reason. I talked about Adam and Eve. I talked about Noah. I talked about Abraham. What about King David? He had a tremendous scandal. He took another man's wife. And then he had the man murdered. Now, let me ask you a question. When King David did this, was this like this shocking thing that had never been done? No, there were scandals from before we could ever even think about them up to the present day. Scandals are part of human beings. And guess what? Whether we like it or not, God allows this. Why? You know, who can answer that? I think ultimately at the end of the day, it's one of the consequences of our free will as human beings. And we know that in order to love freely, we also have the choice to not love freely. And sin does terrible things. And when people give themselves over to sin, they hurt other people. And these scandals are the direct result of that. But they're not new. They're not recent developments, friends. This has been around forever. Now, number 5 is this. We must stand against abuse and fight it and the covering up of it. Right? We can't tolerate it, people. We got to stand against it. We can't have these situations where you've got someone who's been in this behavior and they're allowed to continue in the church, in ministry, in the priesthood. Okay? We can't have that. We can't have people who have attraction to children being around children. We can't have any of those things. We can't have people who have deviant sexual attractions being around situations where those attractions are going to be encouraged and become temptations. And God forbid, when these scandals do occur, we must stand up and we cannot allow anyone to cover them up, hide them, or to lie about them. It's inexcusable. Absolutely inexcusable. And we can't let it happen. Now, we all know plenty of people who've left the Catholic Church because of these scandals and other horrible behavior from those in leadership. But what do you do, right? How do you have that conversation? What do you do when you come up against someone who says things like that? I was talking to a friend the other day, and she was telling me that, you know, she was Catholic, walked away from her faith, and was, you know, in the evangelical world for a while. And she was talking to a friend of hers who's very strong Catholic, and, you know, she said to her, well, you know, what about all the problems in the church and all the this and all the that and the abuse and this and that? You know what her friend said to her? She said, yeah, I recognize that there are problems in the church, but even though there are problems in the church, I could never leave the Eucharist. And she was like, what are you talking about? That conversation led her back into the Catholic faith in a powerful way. And I think there's your answer right there, Olivia. And you kind of mentioned it a little bit in your question, that what you have to do is recognize that those problems are real and you don't leave the church. Those two things can be true at the same time. But what's different is, like, for example, a lot of times in the evangelical and the Protestant world, it doesn't work that way. Because whenever there's a problem, it's real easy to walk away because there's probably nothing inherently special about your particular church that you can't find someplace else. So when there's a problem in this church, you just go to the next church and guess what? They can do it better or whatever. And then what happens? Then there's a problem there. So then you move over here. And then guess what? Oh, no, there's a problem there because there's a person there. And then, you know, that's just the culture that we live in, right? It's sort of the spiritual cancel culture that whenever there's some kind of problem, we just have to instantly throw everything down and say, I'm out of here. I'm out of here. And friends, as we've talked about, if you look back at the way that the Lord and the people of the Lord have understood this covenantal relationship to be, you don't do that. Now, every one of those examples I gave earlier, okay? Let's talk about, Moses with the Israelites in the desert. When there was a sinful problem there, and Aaron, for example, led the children of Israel to make the golden calf and bow down, and Moses came down, and there was all this trouble. Did people go, well, that's it. Can't be an Israelite anymore. I got to go become a Canaanite or an Amorite or an Hittite or something like that. No. They didn't like what was going on, but they stayed. When King David sinned with Bathsheba, and he had Uriah murdered, and that sin was exposed, which obviously it was because we read about it in the Bible. Do people go, oh, wait a second, hold on. Can't live in David's kingdom anymore. I guess I got to leave. I guess I got to go to the Persians or the Babylonians or whatever. I can't do that anymore. I got to go start my own kingdom. No. When Peter sinned and denied the Lord, did the rest of the apostles go, well, okay, I guess we can't be disciples anymore. I guess we got to leave. When Judas betrayed the Lord and then committed suicide, did everybody scatter and go, well, I guess we can't do this anymore? No. See, they had their issues, but they came back together. And every time there's been sin and issues in the church, there's always been people who've wanted to say, well, what are we going to do? But here's the deal. I like Peter's words when people started to walk away from Jesus. He said, Lord, to whom shall we go? For you alone have the words of eternal life. Yeah, people will leave the Catholic Church over this stuff, friends. They will. But are you willing to? I pray the answer is no. I pray that you can look into what Jesus Christ has done in his church and the promises that he's made to his church and his presence in the Eucharist and his promise that even with all of this garbage, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. No matter how bad it gets, we can't leave the Eucharist. We can't leave the family. And I know it's tough, but we got to remember, Catholicism isn't just some other denomination where you can just go down the street and find the next best one, because Catholicism isn't a denomination. Catholicism is that which all the other denominations broke away from at some level, but Catholicism is the root. It's the start. It alone possesses the fullness of the faith. It alone possesses the Pope, which in and of itself sometimes can have a lot of people scratching their heads going, well, what about that? You see? But it isn't about the Pope. It's about the promise that Jesus makes. It's about the promise that he gives to his church, that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. It's about his presence in the sacraments, friends. You can't get that anywhere else. Yeah, you can go become Eastern Orthodox. What about Eastern Orthodox? Okay, you know what? If someone leaves the Catholic Church because of the abuse crisis and they become Eastern Orthodox, let God deal with them, okay? Fine. They got valid sacraments. They got apostolic succession, okay. If that's what happens, okay, whatever, But here's the deal, friends. I ain't going anywhere. And I pray that you won't either. I know it's tough. Remember what it looks like to understand that God's promises are always true, even when we fail in ours. Remember that when we make mistakes, when we sin, when we fall away, guess what? When we have our own scandals that nobody ever hears about, or maybe they do, what are we going to do? See, the danger in focusing on the scandals to the point where it's like, oh, well, they did this and they did that. You know what you end up doing? You end up forgetting about your own scandals. You end up forgetting about your own times in life when you've fallen in sin or when you haven't lived up to what you're supposed to do. Now, again, I'm not excusing what anybody does, and that's the point, friends. When we point the fingers at other people, you know what we often do? We excuse what we do, right? I think it needs to be both. I think we need to recognize sin for what it is. We need to recognize the evil and the hurt, and we need to treat people with loving compassion, no judgment, with open arms, always praying that God's church would be pure, always praying that God's church would be holy, and always willing to offer ourselves up in any way that we can to help people. One of the best things that you might do in your life, friend, is help someone who's walked through something like that. Olivia, I don't know your circumstance. I don't know the person talking to you, but here's the deal. Maybe the person that's asking you that question, maybe they're just trying to throw mud. That's fine. But maybe they're not. Maybe there's really a deep hurt somewhere in their life. And maybe God wants to use you to help heal that in some small way. It can happen, friends. I remember watching the news one time about this priest in Chicago. I mean, he was the guy who got in trouble for, remember this guy? I can't remember his name. He got in trouble for burning the rainbow banner that they found in the back of the church, and his bishop, I think his bishop like disciplined him and they put him away or something like that. And I remember hearing him, or at least he was threatened. I don't know if it actually happened. You guys will know. And I remember him talking, and he was talking about how he himself, as a Catholic priest, he's an abuse survivor. And when he was younger, he was abused by a priest. And I thought to myself, wow, how incredible is that story? That this man who himself was abused by a priest, not only did he stay Catholic, but he himself became a priest. And it's almost like what happened to him, he's redeeming that. Because you had one bad priest and now he's become one good priest. And he's saying, I'm going to wipe out the evil this man did by being a good priest. Now I know that I'm like spiritualizing that. I'm just talking about how I reacted to that or whatever. It's pretty powerful. So friends, how do you apply this to your everyday life? Man, tough stuff, isn't it? Well, I think I've kind of given some answers to that question already, but just to sum up, I think you apply this to your life by being incredibly loving, incredibly free of judgment, incredibly understanding when you encounter someone who's gone through this or has this as a concern. And at the same time, you make sure that nothing takes you away from Jesus and his church. And that if you ever see or catch wind of any kind of abuse, that you don't let it go. That you don't turn your eye to that, a blind eye to it, that you don't in any way allow anything like that to continue, because you might be able to save someone from some incredible hurt and pain. Olivia, man, I feel like this has been a tough episode. It's been tough for me to talk about because I know the hurt. It's been tough probably for some people to hear that have listened to this podcast or watched it, because maybe I'm beyond a shadow of a doubt, I'm sure that there are people that are within range of this thing that have suffered abuse. And I just want to speak directly to you for a second and tell you that, man, my heart goes out to you. And I can't imagine the pain and hurt that you've experienced. And I know it might not sound like much, but I offer my prayers for you. And I pray that God comforts you. Because really, truly, only God can comfort you when you've gone through something like that. No words I can say or anybody else can say is going to make that feel better. Only Jesus can comfort you, and my prayer is that you'd experience that. Friends, thanks for hanging with this. I appreciate you guys so very much. And the fact that you tune in and listen to this and watch this and share this with your friends means the world to me. I'm so blessed and privileged to get to be a part of Down to Earth Ministry and the Ministry of Stewardship and Mission of Faith. If you want more information about any of those things, you can go to down2earthministry.org. It's down, the number 2earthministry.org, stewardshipmissionoffaith.org, and you can learn more about these types of things that we're involved in. Friends, if you need help, I want you to reach out to us. I want you to let us know if there's anything we can do for you. If you need prayer, anything, friends. Now, I'm not saying that I'm like equipped to become like, some great, I'm not a therapist or anything like that. But man, I tell you what, I would love to pray for you. And if you're in a situation where you need help, let me know. And I'll try to do whatever I can to help you. God bless every single one of you guys. And I pray that as you continue to walk in grace and love in your Catholic faith, that all the truths that you hold will connect to your everyday life. God bless you, friends. Take care. Thanks for listening to Catholic Feedback with Keith Nestor. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Stewardship, a mission of faith, and is also supported by our team at patreon.com/Keith Nestor. Please consider joining our support team. Catholic Feedback is a production of Down to Earth Ministries. For more information about Down to Earth or to bring me to your parish or event, visit down2earthministry.org. See you next time.